As an evaluator, you might imagine, I am very keen on data. I think anybody who works on evaluation, on measurement, on metrics knows how important it is to know where we're going. However, what is really important is that policymakers understand that as much or even more than we evaluators or monitoring people do. We have moved from a time of the MDGs, which already focused on metrics and data. It was the first time where we ended up having targets and measurable outcomes, to the SDGs that are much more plentiful, and there are many more targets associated with this. Associated with this whole process has been another evolution where people recognize data is important to make informed decisions. There are big debates whether policy choices should be based only on evidence, which is something that can be criticized because policymakers do have to make choices. However, they should be better informed by the evidence that we can generate. This is even more so as the policy environments become more complex. When you think of the SDGs, there are some that complement each other, reinforce each other, make better use of each other, and where win-win effects can be generated very, very easily. There are others where that is not so easily done, where there are tensions between the different goals and where informed policy making is going to be essential to come out in the best possible place. So evidence, data, understanding of what effects a policy will have is going to be essential to weigh the trade-offs and understand better what is going to be the best option under the given circumstances. Alongside with that whole process has been an evolution also of country ownership. This is something that started in the first meeting in Rome and then the Paris Declaration, which some of you might remember. This is such a long time ago, it's almost forgotten, where ownership was put into the center stage of the discussion. With the Finance for Development Conference in Addis Ababa, which preceded the SDG summit, there was a clear recognition that domestic public resources have increased as a proportional share of what is at the disposal of governments. That means they need to understand their policy making. They need to understand how their policies are influencing the outcomes and how that represents actually what their constituency, what their people in their country actually want, and how they are reached by these policies and programs. So they have become much more of a user of data, or need to grow into that user of data in ways that informs policy making in a better way. It also means that we as development practitioners have to develop capacities in countries, whether they are for statistical capacities or for evaluation capacities, that they can generate these insights on the ground where they are from their perspective in order to make better choices about utilizing what the development partners bring together. So this evaluation has actually covered a lot of ground here in respect to this. It has looked at how well has the World Bank Group helped generate data, analyze the data, put it out at the disposal of users, and how much of this data is being used in the development processes. So we will have presentations by our task team leaders, Rasmus and Sonia, who will speak about the evaluation results, and then that is followed by a panel discussion which our colleague Brenda is going to facilitate. But before we get to that, I would like to invite Shanta Devarayan, the Senior Director of the Development Economics Department, where the whole data work sits in the World Bank Group. So please welcome Shanta to the podium.
I mean, we think of data, particularly in the policy arena, as useful for decision making. You want to inform decisions, or you want decisions to be better informed with data. And yet at the same time, we see in this report, the IEG evaluation talks about it, there's some chronic problems we encounter time and time again with data. They're underfunded. In every situation I've seen, there's a problem with funding for data. Then there's a problem, as the report talks about, of people sharing data. It's undershared, I would say, more or less. And now there are these problems with partnerships. And I was wondering, I mean, if data is so useful for informing decision makers, why do we have these problems over and over again? And then you think about the analogy with the private sector. Because, the private sector, they use data all the time. I mean, that's how they make decisions, and these are decisions worth a lot of money. Where to drill for oil and things like that. And the decision maker uses data to inform that decision, because if you get it wrong, it could be serious. And you don't hear complaints in the private sector for that data is underfunded or unshared. I mean, they don't share it with their competitors for sure, but within the institution, they can share it. And that made me think that maybe this analogy that we draw from the private sector in saying that our data also is to inform decision making is not the right analogy. That, in fact, public policy decision making, especially in the development field, which is the one we're in, is very different from a decision maker looking at data about where to drill for an oil field and then taking the decision then and there. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and let's take a step back and say, what are the problems of development that we're faced with on our day-to-day life? What are the problems that decision makers? I mean, we have problems like, corrosive energy subsidies. In my former region, in the MENA region, we have tons of energy subsidies up to the order of 10% of GDP that deplete the environment, that are mainly going to the rich and also affect the treasury. We have problems of trucking monopolies in Africa. You have in each African country, there's a regulation in the books that there can only be one trucking company. And those trucking companies are now actually charging very high prices, and that's actually undermining Africa's competitiveness. But you can see why, if there's one trucking company, and have been that way for 50 years, they don't want to deregulate trucking. And, if the president's brother happens to own the trucking company, there's no hope of deregulation. And we have the problem, as mentioned in the WDR of this year on education, that we have almost 100% enrollment in primary schools around the world, and yet the learning outcomes are incredibly poor. In India, 80% of the children in rural primary schools in India could not read a single word in a paragraph. Second grade students, and 80% of the second graders couldn't do a two-digit subtraction problem. And one of the reasons for that is that the teachers are absent about 25% of the time. And then you also think about, how can that continue that way? Well, the teachers in many of these places are ones running the election for the local politician. And so you have this cozy relationship where the teacher gets the politician elected, the politician turns around and gives the teacher a job for which he doesn't have to show up. And they're both happy, but the children are not learning. These are the big problems of development that we're trying to inform. Now, you can see the way I presented these, that these problems are not something where a decision maker can wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to fix energy subsidies today. Because he can't. The political pressure is such that it's not something that a single decision maker can take. What it's going to take is if there's a political consensus around that decision that actually then forces the decision maker's hand. But you realize that this involves some people losing those rents that they're earning from the existing distortions. There are people who are benefiting from energy subsidies, very powerful people in Egypt, as Auguste knows, who are going to be very upset. And some of them are connected to the government. So the role of so the decision making has to be on a basis of building this political consensus. Now here's where data comes in, because data can help inform that political consensus. By putting data out there to the general public and helping to nourish the debate out there. So it's not informing the policymaker, the decision maker. It's informing the public so that they can then, when they see the data, when they see who is benefiting from energy subsidies, or they see why that these children are not learning in school, they can then start demanding, why aren't my children learning in school? And then the politician really has to take the decision. Whereas if left to his own devices, he may not. But this is a very different way of looking at the role of data. It's a very powerful role that data is playing, but it's a very different one from saying that data is there that you give to a decision maker and help him or her take a decision. But now if you accept this idea that what the role of data, the role that data plays is to inform the general public, and that the general public can then hold politicians accountable, that changes, or that helps to explain why we have these problems of underfunding, undersharing, and partnerships. Because if you think about it, if that is the role for data, then there are some governments who don't want these data to be made public, right? Because that's going to actually force me to take a decision that I don't want to take. We had this problem when we started doing the absentee surveys in India. This was back in 2002. The Indian government tried to stop us. I mean, they didn't officially try to stop us. They said you needed the signature of the joint secretary, the additional secretary, and the secretary in every state that we ever wanted to work in, and which is basically their way of saying, we're not going to let you do it, right? But I'm stubborn about these things, so I sort of said, no, this is a research project. I don't need signatures, and we need to do it, and we did it. But you can see how they had already done the calculation that if this stuff gets out, I'm in trouble because, frankly, a lot of the Department of Education is in the pocket of the teachers' unions in many of these countries. So you can see already there's an adversarial relationship between policymakers or decision makers and data. So then it's not surprising that they're not willing to allocate a lot of money for data collection. But that's exactly why I think we do need to invest in data, because it is actually to achieve the kind of development outcomes we want to achieve, despite the fact that there's resistance on the part of some governments. But the second point, and this is sort of reinforces the underfunding, is that for this data to be useful in the sense that I just outlined, that it's given to the public so that they can actually decide how to put pressure on the politicians, it becomes a public good, because it has to be disseminated to the public. I can't choose whom I can give that data to. I can't go out and collect data and say I'm only going to give it to Haishan, right? It has to be broad-based for two reasons. One is that's one way to make sure it's accurate. It's to do the verification. Because if data is kept secret, it could be all sorts of nonsense in there. Indeed, that may be another reason why some governments don't want to share their data, is because they're afraid that we'll find all the flaws in it. But the second is that it has to be a genuinely public good, because we don't know ex ante who should have access to it. So you want to make sure it's accessible to as many people as possible, and in a way that's accessible to many people as possible. But that in turn means, like all global public goods, that there's a free rider problem. No one person wants to pay the cost, and that's where you have the underfunding for data, as you do for other global public goods. So if you buy this description of the role of data and the power of data, and also the explanation for why it has some problems, what can we do? That's my final point. And particularly what the World Bank can do. in this setting. I mean, the first is actually, I mean, some of you I saw nodding your heads when I was telling you this theory of government failure as the challenge of development. But let me tell you, if you and people when I explain it to people, and not just me, but lots of people talk about this now, everyone accepts it intellectually, but it actually goes against the grain of some of the World Bank's own actions. So, for the World Bank to come clean, we have to say, look, we're about trying to overcome government failures. And the way to overcome government failures is to empower people, citizens of the countries. But this is a very tricky thing because we are dealing with governments. Now, our only obligation is to deal with governments for the financial relationship, and that's only because they're the only ones who can pay us back. But for our knowledge relationship, we have to be very explicit that this is something we do for the citizens of the country. But if the World Bank champions that, that's one way of then fighting the resistance of governments, because as I said, the governments are going to resist this because this is actually, some data can actually throw them out of power. I know for a fact, in Tanzania, we were doing a similar absentee study, teacher absentee study with RAPOA, with the Research Institute in Tanzania. And it so happened the way things were collected, the results were going to be published 3 weeks before the election. And the government just went ballistic. Before they had seen the results. So I kept saying, how do you know they're bad? Well, they knew, or they were expecting it, and finally we relented. You kind of understand, right? You don't want this to be the election story. They always win the election, so it didn't really matter that much. But they give you an idea of how powerful this can be. But that's the thing. So the bank has to sort of take it very seriously, saying that data is not just a frill. It's not just an intellectual exercise that DEC does. Not that DEC is above doing intellectual exercises, but rather that this is our core mandate. If our problem is trying to overcome government failure, if our challenge is to overcome government failure, then data is part of our toolkit. It's our instrument that we have in order to inform the public so that they can then bring pressure to bear on the political decisions. So that's the first thing has to be that from the mandate of the World Bank has to be seen as data, not just not some of the other things that we put into our mandate. But the second, and that's equally important, is if we accept that, and if we accept this idea that for data to be useful in bringing about the kind of change, it has to be made public. It has to be a public good, right? Then the second level decision is we should invest in data the way we invest in other global public goods. So, there's lots of talk about climate change. Everyone talks about climate change as a global public good, which is true, right? Well, this is on the same level as climate change. If you really think about it, we should be investing in data the way we invest in climate mitigation, in CO2 mitigation. This is as important to the future of the planet. And it is going to be underfunded if we leave it to the individual countries and individual agencies to do it. So that's the second point is that the bank spends its money on national public goods and global public goods. And we need to think about how much we're spending on global public goods. And there's a question as to whether that's not enough in itself. But then within that, how much of that should go to data? And then finally, we get to the partnerships. Because if you think about data as this global public good, then it also makes sense for it to be a partnership, because it's the international community that benefits from the production of this data. I would even go as far as to say, if the international community isn't contributing to the costs, then they're being free riders. The classic problem with global public goods. But then we need to structure the partnership in such a way that is what we're all trying to do. It isn't the question of, one donor trying to finance data collection in Benin because they're actually obsessed about agriculture or something like that, because that then becomes a national public good or even a private good in some cases. But rather that the international community, like it invests in climate change or it invests in international global security and things like that, should be part of that challenge. And so I would structure the partnership around global public goods rather than as a separate standalone activity on data. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Caroline and Shanta. This evaluation was absolutely fascinating to work on because the World Bank's data work is so important and so well recognized for the reasons that Shanta laid out, and also because the team was absolutely fabulous to work with, including Sonia Carvalho, the other team leader who's here with us. I'm going to sum up quite briefly the high-level findings, and using social media and polls, because our communications people tell us that that's the way to do it nowadays. So we have to get our cell phones out and log into, where did it go? To polev.com IG now. And the so please log in here. The first tweet is about the bank's reputation, which we really picked up from surveys, from interviews. You have a fantastic reputation on data. There's high respect, high visibility. The World Bank's two most it's a little tricky, this one. The bank's two most visited websites are in fact on data. And when we think of bank data, what comes to mind? Things like household surveys, the doing business, the World Development Indicators, and many more. Also, they're also sector specific. At country level, the bank's statistical capacity building projects have been mostly effective at improving statistics. When we think back to how things were 10, 15 years ago, countries are in a much better place. Countries like Tanzania, Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, Peru, and bank data projects have actually been somewhat better than their reputation in helping foster better data production in those countries. But we've not always been equally effective at promoting data sharing. And as Shanta explained, some governments remain secretive. They cite quality concerns or fear of losing revenue, but there could also be other reasons for not sharing data that they don't cite. So the first poll here is about how can the bank be better at promoting data sharing? What would be the key action here? And it looks like people, you already got your phones out and are busy. Have everybody voted? A few people are still working on it. Let's see, what do we have? So I see people take a little bit of a hard line on funding here. Make funding for data conditional on prompt sharing of data. Seems to be the most popular response. So we have tried conditionality in the past, of course, and there's a little bit of a mixed history, but it sort of makes sense, right? I mean, if the international community finances this data, well, it should be made public. Let's move on to the topic of data use, right? After all, we all care about data being used for something, for targeting, for better policies, for monitoring. Ultimately, what we hope to is to get into a place where there's more data use that then leads to demand for data and financing for data that then generates more production of data, more use. So we want that kind of positive cycle. And this has been a chronic problem that in evaluations over the last 15 years have really found that we keep forgetting to focus on data use. Not just the World Bank, also other agencies. It's been the same in the UN system, that somehow it's easier to focus on data production and data use becomes somewhat neglected. It is hard to do. It's also hard to know whether you have success on data use, but ultimately that is what I think we should care about. I think part of the problem is that the bank is a task-driven organization, and individual tasks focus on data for their specific purpose, not fostering data use and evidence-based policy making in the countries. So how do we haven't figured out a way to mainstream, if you like, data use across tasks, the way that climate change or gender has been mainstreamed. We haven't done that yet. And that's maybe part of the problem. So people are already responding to the next poll here. To what one thing could the bank do to better promote data use in client countries? I'm not so much worried here about the international community, researchers and what have you. They're all very adept users of data and very frequent users of World Bank data. It's now we're more talking about the client countries. So perhaps inspired by Shanta's remark, there's a lot of sympathy here for promoting citizen demand for data. Maybe also easier said than done. Giving voice to data users in statistical capacity projects is something that we are already doing, at least in the good practice projects. And a common framework, having something to fall back to. How do we boost data literacy and data use? I think in our evaluation we actually sort of favor all the first four. We write that to do better on data use would really require a concerted effort across tasks and across sectors, and that we should lean heavy on country directors and country partnership frameworks to take ownership of the data agenda in each country. Moving on to data, to the last one is about partnerships. Why does it keep I want to tweet on data partnerships. Where did it go? No. That was yeah. We find that there was in the past this very clear architecture around data partnerships. It was tied up to the MDGs. There was the Busan Action Plan. The bank housed and supported a number of programs and trust funds. There was coherence and alignment. But somehow that is not really the case any longer. Funding sources for data are drying up. New trust funds have not really been forthcoming to the same extent. And without sustained funding for data, there's even risk that some countries will backslide on data quality. So to mobilize more funding for data, what action could we take? And you guys are good with this. I see a lot of sympathy here for setting up a global umbrella financing mechanism for data. It's obviously not something the World Bank can do on its own. So the action would be to initiate it, to convene it, mobilize resources and efforts together with others. And I should say that in the evaluation, our recommendation emphasizes all the first three here. They're not mutually exclusive. We really think that the World Bank could play a transformational role to help create this kind of data, a better mechanism or framework for data financing in partnership with others. Thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion where we will come back to all of these points.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ida MacDonald. I'm here from the OECD in Paris, and I work with the Secretariat to the Development Assistance Committee. So thank you very much for the invitation to come to this launch event today. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it has been a great pleasure to work with the evaluation team over the course of this year, because we, over the course of this year, have been working on the 2017 Development Cooperation Report, which also focused on data and data for development. And I think that's why I'm invited here today. So, without further ado, let me share some of our messages and relate them back to the evaluation. I should say that I'm speaking with two hats. My first hat is that of the manager of this bulky report. We have a highlights outside, and I urge you to download the report because I won't do much justice to it today. We launched the report in the United Kingdom in October with DFID, who's a main financer of data for development in the bank, actually, I think, and around the world. For us, with the bank, one of our key messages is that we want to really mobilize more political support, more and better investments, and more collective action to bridge a worrying data divide for development. Despite all the great progress that has been made over the past decade to have more and better data, we must not forget two important contextual facts. 44% of countries worldwide do not have adequate capacity to register births and deaths fully. And that's based on the analysis of the World Bank Statistical Capacity Indicator. For most members of the DAC, of the Development Assistance Committee, building capacity to produce and use data and statistics is not a priority. Just 5 countries account for 78% of bilateral aid to statistics, and that's $181 million per year. Progress made so far would not have been possible without the leading investments made by the World Bank, with support mostly, as I mentioned, from DFID. Up to 2015, the World Bank was a leading investor in statistics, and as we find out in the evaluation, the tide seems to be turning a little bit on that, and the investments are declining. My second hat is to speak on behalf of Johannes Jutting, who is the manager of one of those partnerships you talk about in the report, the Paris 21. I will share some feedback on Johannes's behalf because he couldn't make it because his flight was cancelled, unfortunately. Paris 21 is one of those organizations that has received funding over the past 15 years from the Development Grant Facility, which I guess most of you know no longer exists. And we was very happy to see some positive findings about Paris 21 in the evaluation. So let me just touch now on some of a general assessment of this evaluation, and then I'll talk a little bit about the partnerships. This evaluation is extremely timely because it provides evidence of what works in terms of statistical capacity building as the World Bank has been doing. And this is a space where actually there hasn't been much evidence, and evidence is quite scarce. We can learn a lot from this evaluation, and I want to stress the learning from evaluations because that's very important, right, Brenda? Because demand for data, especially related to the SDGs, has never been greater. And the pressure on countries, national statistical systems, and international organizations is very high to deliver and report on the SDGs, the indicators, and we know that we actually don't have data for about 2/3 of the 232 indicators. And also, at the same time, the supply of data has never been greater. And the report and the evaluation talks about big data and the data revolution. But we know that actually about 90% of the data that's produced by big data is not even analysed or structured. So one could argue that such a healthy supply and demand for data is an opportunity to fill the data gaps that we're worried about. This is true. At the same time, the data ecosystem is getting more and more complex with so many actors involved in producing this data, and the architecture around that is very weak. So our report argues that the data gaps risk widening further because basic capacity to seize the opportunities continues to be weak, especially so in LDCs and in fragile states. A second risk is the lack of credibility and trust in data and statistics in this era of fake news and alternative facts. The OECD's chief statistician misses the point. This environment of fake news, alternative facts, puts even more responsibility on statisticians as the custodians of the evidence base for policy making. Statisticians must be capable of standing up for the right of all citizens to true, reliable, and accessible information. The evaluation's recommendations on big data are very well balanced, and they chime with the recommendations in our report that countries and their development partners need to make statistical laws, regulations, and standards fit for the changing data ecosystem. Capacity building requires long-term commitment and with slow and not so visible results. Supporting it, capacity building is the real public good because it can enable country and citizens to produce and use the data they need to set and monitor their priorities. But as I mentioned, bilateral donors seem to be shying away from these long-term efforts, and that's why we need multilaterals, which have different pressures to show results, to step up. The World Bank still has an exceptionally important role to play as the main repository of development data. We know about the World Development Indicators, is very important. An experienced capacity builder that can engage in the long term. But we see that the evaluation shows a growing mismatch between the past role played by the bank, the latest commitments you have to civil registration and vital statistics in IDA 18, on gender data, and you have a program for addressing development data gaps, yet your resources are declining. One more minute. So now let me just turn to the second issue to do justice to Johannes, if you don't mind, Brenda. We concur on the global partnerships. We concur with the assessment that the World Bank has played a pivotal role providing the public good and strengthening capacities through its own work and partnerships. However, as the evaluation makes clear, since the Development Grants Facility has stopped, the World Bank's role has significantly defined as an incubator or facilitator of partnerships that have a proven record of results. The consequences, as clearly stated in the evaluations, that these partnerships are now at risk. Paris 21, for example, had 50% of its funding from the finance facility. Now that's gone from zero from the financing facility. And this really puts its partnership and the trust it has built with national statistical offices in working with national strategies for development of statistics, which is praised in the report or recommended, at risk. So the very good assessment in Chapter 2, and I'll finish, is that there is a great assessment in Chapter 2, but Johannes feels that it's not fully reflected in the recommendation, which should clearly call for addressing this unfortunate situation around financing, to put the World Bank back on the agenda and form its contributions to data as a public good. Few other development partners are ready and able to step into the big shoes of the World Bank. There are not many out there. Please be an enabler and a mobiliser for more coordinated and harmonised approaches by donors, gaining efficiency and greater results through pooled funding approaches that support capacity over the long term. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to join you today. My name is Samantha Custer. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis for a group called AidData. We are a research and innovation lab. We track financing for development around the world, and we look at the uptake of ideas, particularly data and evidence, in the policymaking process. So I wanted to first say from the outset, to echo something that Shanta said earlier, information is certainly never the hero of the story, but it does play a supporting role in how leaders allocate scarce resources and accelerate development in their communities, and certainly citizens are part of that story as well. But it would be mistaken to not say that calls for a data revolution will ring hollow if we can't decode what evidence leaders use in their decision-making and why. And so when we talk about the role of the World Bank in supporting evidence-based policymaking in countries around the world, I would argue that we really need to look at two dimensions of this in practice. The World Bank as a direct provider of data and evidence that people consume, as well as the World Bank as a catalyst. I think Ida called it an enabler. I would agree with that aspiration. A catalyst seeking to strengthen domestic data ecosystems through technical and financial assistance. And so today I'll speak briefly to how the World Bank is performing vis-a-vis other development partners in both of these roles, as well as reflect on how the World Bank can further increase its impact moving forward. And for this discussion, I'll draw on a few relevant findings from a new AidData report we released just today entitled Decoding Data Use. I won't get into all of it here, but we'll certainly circulate it after the event. So in the report, we analyzed the responses of 3,500 leaders from 126 low and middle income countries to AidData's 2017 Listening to Leaders survey. These participants come from different stakeholder groups. They answered questions about the types of data analysis they use, from what sources, and for which purposes in the context of their work. They also rated the helpfulness of these sources. We analyzed the responses in an effort to offer insights to how funders, producers, advocates for data, including the World Bank, can best position themselves for greater impact. So I understand that the slides are very difficult to see. Don't be alarmed, that's fine. I'm just going to speak into the broader themes, and you can use those as a visual anchor. So first I wanted to look at the World Bank as a direct provider of data and analysis to policymakers and how it performs relative to other actors. So in general, we find that multilateral organizations are the preferred providers of international information sources in both use and helpfulness. In fact, 5 out of the top 10 international sources of development data, shown on the left of the slide, in overall levels of reported use were multilateral organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations. I will also say that the World Bank performed particularly well as a go-to source of information for nearly half of all users of international data. And remarkably, the World Bank's dominant market position is quite consistent across different types of stakeholder groups, policy areas, and regions of the world. For example, leaders ranked the World Bank among the top 3 most used sources of data and analysis in all 6 policy areas that we covered in the study. But you might be asking, to what extent does money matter in whether leaders choose to pay attention to information from development partners like the World Bank? We do see that larger donors tend to attract a greater number of users of their data and analysis overall, but that some organizations are clearly punching above or below their financial weight. And so according to our first value for money index, we see that multilateral organizations like the World Bank, the European Union, and the International Monetary Fund are efficiently converting large development assistance budgets into greater than expected uptake of their data and analysis. Large bilateral aid providers like the US and Germany also perform well on this measure. But financial clout is not deterministic in terms of the value that leaders derive from a particular information source. There's a difference between the use of data and the perceived helpfulness of data in policymaking. And we see that organizations that have a mandate to focus on a particular geographic region or sector, such as regional development banks, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, etc., they receive the highest marks when it comes to the perceived helpfulness of their information. And that makes sense because they are able to focus on a particular bounded or defined group of users and focus their end products to that end. I also wanted to turn to the World Bank's more direct role or indirect role as a data catalyst through its efforts to invest in the capacity of national actors to produce high-quality data and statistics. And here, as the World Bank contemplates its future role in this area, I wanted to suggest that it would do well to double down in 2 areas of a real demand from public, private, and civil society officials in partner countries, and that is national statistics and project-level evaluations. So recent calls to strengthen national statistics systems appear to be well-founded. We find that the vast majority of leaders not only utilize national statistics, but they found it to be the most helpful source of raw data out there from domestic organizations. And so we would say that funders should ramp up efforts in these areas. But I would also say that proponents of rigorous impact evaluations would be cheered to know that international development agencies are not the only prospective users of this information. Domestic leaders frequently reported using project evaluation data and rated it as the most helpful source of international data at their disposal. And development partners should take note. Investing in strong evaluation systems isn't just about improving project performance for development partners. It's actually information that leaders on the ground can use to think about what works, what doesn't, and why. So I wanted to go beyond these 2 specific investment areas of national statistics and project-level evaluations to think a little bit about what the World Bank can learn from what leaders have to say about what information is helpful to them and what they would like to see information providers doing differently. And I'll highlight 3 things very quickly because of time. So first is that context is key. Leaders place a high premium on data and analysis that gets it. So essentially, if you want to capture the attention of leaders, information providers must demonstrate a clear understanding of local realities. And that, of course, underscores a natural tension that data producers like the World Bank face in balancing cross-national comparability and country-specific insights. The second thing I'll say is be constructive. Leaders want more specificity, not less, when it comes to determining how to respond to development challenges and what solutions are best. A concrete set of policy recommendations was the most frequently cited attribute of what made information helpful to leaders. And producers can better serve their target users by helping them think through how to use data to adjudicate between different priorities and to partner with local intermediaries to identify context-appropriate solutions. And finally, be responsive. Leaders want different things from domestic producers of data than international providers. From domestic providers, they want these producers to incorporate more government data in their analytical products and regard them more highly when they do. They want these producers to prioritize remedying technical deficiencies, like the quality and timeliness of their data. But the value propositions for international organizations like the World Bank are somewhat different. Leaders viewed this international data as signaling how they can best position their country to access foreign assistance. So it's interesting, the connection between tying money to data sharing. And survey respondents still, however, wanted these producers to align the data and analysis they produce with national priorities. So with that, thank you so much.
I actually want to start with a question based on Shanta's very interesting idea, right? So we talk about evidence-based policymaking, the idea that, okay, so we're going to provide you data, and then the policymakers will make decisions based on that evidence. And I guess, hi, Sean, maybe I'll ask this first question of you, which is this idea of, well, no, there's so many other factors that go into the policymaking. How can we, the World Bank, sort of nourish the debate? What else can we do to get people interested in having the data they need, interested in it, so that they can then pressure the decision makers to make decisions based on the data?
I'm really glad we're here. I think I know I'm here not just representing my own development data group, but also representing the development data work at the bank as the co-chair of the development data council, because we really welcome this evaluation. It's really timely. It will be a shame if we don't fully recognize how the world is changing, how the development data landscape is changing. Not only that the kind of data from MDGs to SDGs that we are moving away from just the aggregate broad trend kind of information, trying to get more integrated granular information data that can really lead to localized solutions. And also the development data players community is also evolving so fast. So while we are reflecting on what we have been, thank you for having patted our shoulder on what bank has been able to achieve over the past couple of decades, particularly in terms of how we have been putting out to the world the useful kind of data products and services, but also to support capacity development in countries. We're also keenly aware if we don't admit that we're also exploring what is the new approach, what will be different from before over the next couple of decades, and not acknowledging that we don't have a set map or roadmap moving forward, we'll be kidding ourselves, and that'll be a total arrogance. It's precisely because we're exploring what would be new, what would be the new approach. That's why this discussion is so useful. So thank you for OECD for your report, the Data for Development report, but also for Samantha, what you just released really showed how bank need to scale up our own commitment and effort, both as the direct data providers, but also as enablers. So really in this context, I think your question is very valuable. And Shanta really put this in a very provocative context. That is, what we're facing is not just technological capacity or technological solutions that we need to explore and try it out and find it that where we can scale up for solving development problems, but how to overcome the political barriers and political economy. Therefore, the kind of political dialogue will be very important by bringing the users with the producers together at global level. But more importantly is for us to bring the impact of the right kind of data being used in the right place to the surface so that we can really demonstrate where there's the real value and real potential of the better data that we need to generate and put in the use in the public so that we can not only have the informed public, but also help create that political consensus that we can help influence decision making. And here I must say that World Bank's leadership role is at multiple levels. First of all, internally, I'm so glad the bank has positioned data more towards the first-class citizen rather than always at the bottom of the priority list. By having created a World Bank Development Data Council that allowed us to pull the different parts of the bank together to influence the senior management thinking and our operational work in terms of where the bank need to do more in terms of development data priorities, and also to coordinate our efforts. And secondly is globally. Both you, Ada, and Samantha mentioned that bank has played a role in creating a partnership to bring not only development donors together, but also really focusing on what we can do with national statistical systems. But the landscape is changing. We increasingly need to engage with those data producers, both private sector and civil societies, that we have not been working with, and we really have not found the best way to work with each other yet, but in a much more proactive way to learn together by creating a kind of global forum of learning. This is also why not only we want to continue to find a way to support national statistical systems to learn how to use the new technology and how to do better at countries, but also to see how we can develop new collaboratives. This is why we joined forces in creating the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which now has more than 250 members, private sector, government, and civil societies, and so on and so forth, to really see where we can work together to promote data innovation. Okay. But also the World Data Forum is another lively interactive space for us to do it. But at the same time, at local level, at country level, how through banks' own data operation to experiment with new approaches to solve different problems, as well as helping our country teams through systematic country diagnostic, as well the country partnership framework to really insert this focused attention on data and see how we can help channel financing towards addressing data gaps.
Thank you. So I see a question in the back. You can, a microphone's coming to you. Since we have people online, it's best if you ask the question into the microphone.
Hi, my name is John. This question is addressed to Shanta, and really I think he, Can you hear me?
There you go. There you go.
This question is addressed to Shanta. Actually, he mentioned the biggest, in my view, problem here is the political impediment. That is that the question we have to ask, for example, is that we can give this advice year in and year out. Somehow it's not implemented or it's ignored. It's not because the politicians or the people who control the policymakers are ignorant, like you point out. They know the use of data. Some of them are very, very good, but they choose not to use the data that has been provided. And I think instead of holding the politics constant and then coming up with this fairly good advice on how this data can transform this, I think it should be in tandem. Because no matter how much expertise you put out there, if the political economy is not supportive, it will be for naught, because the politicians will actually obstruct the worthwhile use of the information that you have. Then you must then walk back and ask yourself the question, what is this for? Is it for some hope in future that things will change? Because sometimes you reach a very grim and pessimistic conclusion of the kind that Douglas North reaches when he says, let's face facts, this is how things will be, and there's no way of changing it. Thank you.
Did you want to respond? I mean, I think he's agreeing with you that the key is political pressure. Right. So I think you're agreeing with Shanta, and I think he has, basically said that, right, we're not just holding the politicians accountable, but we have to have others pressuring them to make different decisions. I have a question from the audience. It's actually for Samantha, from the online audience, I assume.
Can you please elaborate what you mean by project-level data and clarify your vision for how the World Bank can improve data capture and publication?
Sure. So essentially, we took, in our survey of leaders, we took a very broad look, a broad interpretation of raw data and analysis. So any types of development data that leaders could use when they make decisions to allocate resources, to monitor results, to evaluate progress. And then any derivative analysis, so qualitative, quantitative, or impact evaluations. And so when we are... Sorry, the question again, just remind. Project level data, thank you. So for evaluation data specifically, they were talking about project and program level evaluation data, essentially things that would allow supporting of monitoring and evaluation of specific development projects and programs at the local level. And so this actually, interestingly enough, came up as important from both domestically produced data and internationally produced data. But it's most important from international sources, perhaps because it's seen as more objective and it's farther away. So I think that this is good news for those that are actually proponents of evaluation data. Often there's a concern that these things are kind of like locked in silos or gathering dust. Well, it turns out that there are active users within governments, and actually among all stakeholder groups that we looked at, we surveyed government, civil society, and private sector leaders. It was host government officials that felt most adamantly about this when you look at the breakdown. And so I think when I pose this as a recommendation for the bank, it's saying, okay, well, let's continue to invest as the World Bank in producing good evaluations and ensuring it's disseminated in various ways so that it's not locked behind a PDF ghetto. But at the same time, how do you support the capacity of local level actors, governments, government agencies, et cetera, to produce their own effective impact evaluations as well?
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question that targets data quality and data use. So I wondered if the evaluation looked at all at the difference in just the numbers that are generated within the statistical department of the Bureau of Statistics and Ministry of Finance. We know that happens in many, many countries. How do you reconcile that, and what is the political implications of backing one versus the other?
Thank you.
So, for example, in Peru, there was a big concern at some point about the poverty data, and they were disputed validity, and the bank actually stepped in and helped them form a working group that agreed on methodologies and standards, and created a nationally recognized and respected poverty estimate. And then the bank went on to work with a whole host of ministries and agencies on data production and data use in the respective areas, supported by a very, very capable team of people that were sector experts, but also really knew and understood data very well. So I think your question is a little bit larger about data quality, and but that's very much part of what the bank data projects work on in a lot of countries, helping them comply with recognized international standards around data quality. It's been quite a bread and butter also of a large number of trust-funded as well as AidData and IBRD projects over many years to bring standards up.
Thank you. Well, and we also mentioned that the idea of the more you share the data, the more you sort of have this crowdsourcing effect that people can validate and check the data if it's available and they can be compared. I was wondering, since you did a similar study, we talked about sort of the financing challenges, but what are some of the other challenges relative to data sharing, and what are some of the things that you think could be done to increase data sharing?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to focus on one aspect of data sharing, which comes back again to capacity development. A key message and part of our analysis is that data has focused predominantly on data production. This is because there is a large demand coming from outside of the countries to monitor global development more generally. There is a huge demand for production because the international providers are conscious about the results that they achieve, and they need evidence and quantified data on the results they're achieving. And we are neglecting what we call about the whole data cycle. So we want this kind of virtuous data cycle that reinforces that demand for more and better, but that is also looking at data use and data sharing. To quote Samantha and work that they have done, and there's this fabulous term called data graveyards, whereby actually the business of development cooperation invests so much in producing data that much of it is actually not used or not shared. So a first practical step can be, and of course the question that comes to many providers as I speak about the development provider business is that they may have concerns themselves about the quality of the data and the quality of the evidence they're using to design their projects and to evaluate their projects. And that deserves its own analysis and discussion. But that already by having that principle of sharing and of transparency of data, it would really probably expose a lot of challenges and put pressure on for more harmonized approaches. So there really is a space at the country level for the donors as predominant financiers of data production, but all to work better together and to also think about how you empower citizens to actually produce their own data and to monitor development from where they are. So there's some points I would make. Thank you.
Thanks. Looks like you want to say something.
Just to add to this, I think I'm so glad I'm joined by my colleagues here. I look at Amparo, who has been for the past number of years leading our effort in supporting countries to, first of all, assess their readiness to open up their data, but also to provide technical support once they are determined to do so. I think we have supported, over 50-some countries in the past 3, 4, 5 years. But supporting country to be more open to share their data, to allow us to put data in the hands of the public, and therefore can help force political consensus for change in decision making is one thing. But bank itself will need to do much better. We indeed, some years ago, led the Open Data Initiative and opened up banks' own data holding. That's what reflected in your statistics why bank is a source of such a public access of the information needed. But more importantly, we need to ensure that our own staff has this invited mindset of sharing data that we have been able to lay our hands on from our different projects and processes so that the value of the data could really be maximized. And this is also why 2 weeks ago, under the Data Council, we launched the Development Data Hub of the World Bank as an internal process of making sure the kind of data holdings that bank has will first of all be documented and made accessible for our analysis and to support our program and project design, but also to the extent possible to share with the wider public through our Open Data Initiative. So this is really both in terms of the practice and commitment of a development organization itself before we can go out to support countries to do more.
So heal ourselves first and then support others. Okay, one of the key questions that Rasmus wanted us to discuss was what role should the World Bank Group play in convening and helping create a data financing mechanism and partnership architecture? And when you did the poll, I noticed that for the partnerships, that sort of creating an umbrella financing mechanism was one of the things that the audience, you said, was one of the most important things. So does anybody want to think about how the World Bank, what role the World Bank should take in going about trying to support that?
I'll dive in. A couple of thoughts on that. So, I think when you think about the role of the World Bank in convening this type of group, I think there's an opportunity for it to emphasize matching contributions, both from international actors and country-level actors. I think this is something that probably Ida has picked up in her Data for Development report, that I think the challenge with international financing for domestic data is that it's episodic. And it's depending upon the variable priorities that international organizations have, and when the donor has moved on, the data collection, the production stops. And so you don't want that to happen. And so is there an opportunity for international contributions to kind of crowd in some sustainable funding from those local level actors. I think the other piece, and this is something that we actually covered in the Data Graveyards report that Ida also referenced, is that, a very real challenge that domestic data producers have, even if they're bought into the idea of transparency, and certainly there are many political factors that many agencies are concerned on various levels of opening up, but even among the more enlightened that want to, they're thinking about the business model of it. How do I pay for this? That's like a dirty word in the open data community. We never talk about how do you pay for this? And so, that would be another way to think about this convening power of a data financing mechanism, is to say, how do you actually come alongside domestic data producers to deal with some of this? How do you think about the early stage infrastructure capacity, the sunk costs that need to happen, and find ways to help them actually deal with the recurring costs and to reduce the costs of that over time so that they can do this effectively. So that would be my 2 cents.
If I could just bounce off that, I think that we stress the point that we need more financing for sure, because but we're talking about financing for statistical capacity building, and we need better financing. So we also need to, I think, have a discussion with the key partners involved in financing statistics that's measured by the press report on what is effectiveness and how is this aid spent effectively. And I think that that's something that we need to do. And then the question is there really actually lack of financing for data per se? We don't really know how much is spent by the international community on surveys and on data. And it would be really interesting, and this is a proposal we have and we would like to discuss with the DAC over the coming year, might we actually try to better track that in expenditure in reporting to the DAC's creditor reporting system. And I think we could be really surprised if we were to have an indicator for that we've tracked those flows and to see how much is spent. And then there's the whole dimension as well, and I like that point of bringing in multiple actors, of data philanthropy and how we work with the private sector to get them also to share their data, but managing it and obviously in a responsible way. Thanks.
Just to take the cue of your comment on, we don't even know how much we're spending on this. Indeed, up until mid last year, the bank in our own operational code, we don't even have one that could help us tag how much is the financing going to countries related to data activities. So thanks to the Data Council, under which we pursued the introduction of a dedicated theme code. Again, I'm looking at Amparo, I know, who has really worked so hard on this together with others in the bank to push this forward. So now we're able to see that, for example, over the past 3 years, AIDA and IBRD financing for data amount to, on average, $90 million a year. But there's a huge variation depending on which country and what size of the AIDA or IBRD project have been channeled through. So it varies from 30 million to 300 million, depending on the year you're looking at and country you're looking at. It's not a lot compared to the broad scheme of things and the need required. So when it comes to financing, we know domestic financing, lending and trust fund-based support need to all come together. And here we're very grateful for the evaluation's observation that is not only we need to pursue a sustainable financing model that allowing us to leverage the 3 streams of funding towards supporting countries. We need to indeed break away from the reliance of trust fund, but acknowledging the catalytic role of trust fund. For example, in the case of Burkina Faso, with only 280K that we were able to put into supporting countries' open data initiative, doing a readiness assessment, and then pointing out without e-governance investment, there will be not much can be truly achieved given the state of the digital connectiveness in the country. So that helped another 20 million AIDA financing being secured into that direction, which has a clear outcome or output indicator on openness of the data to be shared through the government portal. So what I'm saying is there's such a role of trust funds to play in catalyze, what other financing or even domestic financing that can be mobilized. So let's not forget what Shanta just mentioned. For developed data as a global public goods, it's so many freight riders and underinvestment. How we can form a global alliance of really enlightened and committed development partners to come together to pull our resources to where it's needed most. It's very important. So this idea of a global facility is something we ought to look into, despite the difficulties that so many donors are facing. But at the same time, bank itself cannot be a free rider, so to speak. So it's very unfortunate, as Ida pointed out, for 9 years, a bank through the development grant facility, we put in $32 million through Paris 21 to support national statistical systems capacity development. But because of the discontinuation of that, we lost a very viable, very critical means to support a partnership that has such wide reach. So it's something that we've got to reflect very critically internally ourselves.
Good thoughts. Was there someone in the audience who had a question? Yes, go ahead.
Hi. Picking up on this theme that you're just exploring, both AIDA and us in our report found this concentration of funding on a really limited set of countries. While many countries receive some funding, a few countries receive much more. And so that's also part of this global public good versus national public good. How can a partnership or a financing model take that into account, with supply, demand, and capacity to fund? And what would a global partnership look like that would be structured, like you said, Shanta, to really fund GPG? Is it not yet the case with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Data? What needs to change in that framework for it to be more performant?
The Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data has emerged very fast and quickly. But at the same time, with how complex the data landscape is evolving itself, I think the partnership is still at a stage to really try to find what is the best way forward. But definitely try to engage politically to raise the profile of development data more broadly in order to motivate increased support or financing for data and data innovation, both in terms of the government statistical system as well as the broader collaboratives that we're hoping to foster is very critical. And I think how to indeed create meaningful mechanism to channel financing is top on the agenda. But I think that's something we will need to really engage in helping to shape that discussion and shape up that solution. But taking this opportunity, I also want to go back to another point raised, is also reflected in the recommendation of the evaluation, is how banks need to scale up in supporting the capacity of using data more effectively for result. And here, again, I want to stress two things. One is banks' internal capacity and our own knowledge in how to best use data. And as we know, the kind of data needs for more localized solutions is huge, and the data use solutions vary a great deal, and especially the need for looking into how we can integrate different kind of data to generate more granular disaggregated information is very important. I think this is where we need to learn a lot ourselves in order to experiment with what will be the new approach and solutions and what we can help to support and to scale up. So that's one. And secondly, I think as we speak, we're already started engaging with countries in some of the most difficult cases to see how we can support the improvement of data literacy and data use. I look at my colleague Craig. Over the past 2 years, he almost single-handedly started working through Sudan, now broadening into other countries, to engage with civil societies, journalists, government officials, to help develop curriculum and to go there to really work with them so that they can look at data they have at hand and transform that into success stories or policy insight, and in order to really trigger new development thinking and new solutions. So definitely this is one new line of business we will look into to broaden.
Thank you, very interesting.
Thank you. We've been quite preoccupied with the question of how to get this scale up in financing for statistics. And we surveyed our DAC members early on in the process this year, and the findings are published in a working paper, and we asked them how willing they would be to double the amount of aid for statistics based on Paris 21's press report. And there was actually a lot of resistance in the answer, because they were like, well, how do you know how much that costs? And so there's actually a big question mark about input targets and the donors just, abiding, saying, yes, we will double. So we know that according to the report that the Global Partnership of Sustainable Development Data did, that there's about maybe a funding gap of about $200 million to meet the minimum costs of SDG monitoring. So that would be in what we need from aid, is bringing in the partner countries budgeting themselves. So we say that's actually not very much, but to get the buy-in for that requires a process, and it requires this awareness raising, and is what we're trying to do by also trying to get the discussion outside of the data for development community, or bridging the two communities, I should say. So that's really important. And then a key issue that we spotted through Paris 21's work on the national strategies for statistics and the findings from the latest reporting on the SDG indicators is that actually national statistical plans don't even have budgets. So countries don't even know how much they should be spending on the statistics. And these statistical plans are quite separate to the national development strategies. So how can we have a more integrated approach where actually statistics, the cross-cutting dimension of statistics, is integrated into the national development plans and is budgeted for, and then you have the discussions with the providers and the other sources of investment around financing that. So maybe some of that architecture should really be at the national level. The global architecture is very challenging, as you all know, to manage. Thanks.
Great. Well, I want to be sure. Okay. And then we'll bring in some online questions, I promise.
Just tying a couple of different threads together on the financing, the targeting, and the partnerships pieces. So, one of the other things that the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data has been promoting is the idea of data compacts, which I think is a marvelous idea because, essentially it's at a country level getting people together to say, okay, what types of data and information do you need to be able to succeed when it comes to the SDGs? But I think it's very critical to figure out who is around that table, and in not only being government producers and international actors, it's CSOs, it's private sector as well. I think also, too, that it's not just a discussion of production of data, but also of use. Who are the potential users, decision makers, community members that want to use that information? And then when it comes to the umbrella financing idea, in an ideal world, to avoid these input targets of just like putting more money, well, more money is great, right? But if it's not directed in the best way, it's not fit for purpose. So, if you could have a structure of this umbrella fund that is saying, okay, we're going in for data compacts, we're going to ensure that we're tracking financing to support these data compacts. We're assessing their effectiveness on the basis of their responsiveness to what people say that they want and what they're using. And that requires greater transparency on the part of investors in this area. We're actually doing a new piece of work right now with the Gates Foundation. It's the first time they've opened up their actual investments on data portfolio at the project level, where we can actually look at the attributes of those investments. I think that donors need to be willing to open up to that level to really look at that, and then have this forum essentially hold themselves to account to be responsive to results. And when it comes to, I think there was an implicit targeting question, I think, in what you raised of, we have a lot of concentration of financing for data and statistics in certain countries and not others. Is that bad? Is that good? There's probably pros and cons. I think the argument I would make, if you're looking for that virtuous cycle, is to say, it's probably more important to get some really strong proofs of concepts where you have willing domestic actors in government, in CSOs, in private sector, and willing international partners to come together around these data compacts and expose themselves to scrutiny. That's probably more important to get that right than necessarily feel like you have to have it completely distributed equitably.
So I want to pull Rasmus into the conversation and get to one of the online questions. So hopefully you can answer Phil Hare's question, which is, what percentage of a development project's cost should be allotted to data collection and evaluation? What is the current average for bank projects, and what should it be in 5 years? Thanks, Phil.
We don't really have the answers to that. There's no clear benchmark to this. We tend to say that monitoring and evaluation, which includes sort of data collection about the project, it might be 0.5%, a couple of percent. It's a very small number. And there's no right or wrong. Sometimes it's more, they spend the money and collect all the data, but don't really use it for anything. so we shouldn't think of it just in terms of the money. So sorry, I can't be more helpful there.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, I know the bank spends a lot of money on working with both the education and management information systems within countries. But you still go and talk to the governments and they say that there are problems with getting that data in a timely manner to make decisions because it's outdated by the time they actually have the data and it can, in the format where it can be used. Is there some thinking, have you looked into this in the evaluation? I was looking at your chapter 3 and it talks about statistical systems, but rethinking the way that you work on improving EMIS and HMIS.
Sure. Did you hear the question, Esther? Please speak into the microphone for the online audience.
Yes, we looked, and I mean, we're not the first to say that. It was already well recognized by the Data Council that administrative data is an area where more and better coordination among donors need to take place. Oftentimes we've seen quite a lot of redundancies. So the World Bank builds or helps building an EMIS, and then with somewhat different needs, another donor may come and help and do different things. So there is a need for coordination, for sure. And then there is a need for just more investment in that. For now, there has been a lot of effort in helping NSOs with household surveys and getting key data that's not routine data, but the next frontier might be the administrative data, including civil registration. And in terms of better using technology for more, routine and more dynamic and quicker data, that's part of the equation. The problem is still the capacity, because that requires local, really embedded statistical capacity, and that's really challenging when you go beyond the national. So that's a big. So we raise that and we recognize that there are efforts, better coordination, more statistical capacity building at the local level might be part of the equation.
Thank you. So it's hard to believe that it's 2 o'clock already, but this has been a really wonderful conversation. I want to thank Haishan, Ida, Rasmus, and Samantha. And, I read in one of the AidData reports a quote from The Economist saying that data has displaced oil as the world's most valuable resource. And so this is an important conversation for us to continue. So thank you for joining us.